Welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex. Today we're going to be painting this lovely set of 5 Space Marines in a grim, dark, yet very efficient yellow. Yellow has a mythical status among miniature painters. Odysseus might as well have added it to the bucket list. Blind the Cyclops, feast with a witch for a year, paint a yellow miniature. The slightly boring fact about yellow paint is that it's yellow paint. The pigment used in yellow miniature paint are notoriously transparentish, and I don't know how many they actually put in there, resulting in paints that have weak coverage. This can be overcome by various methods, but I'd like to show you one of my favorite methods, a method that will not require an airbrush, is exceptionally efficient and requires no expert level skill. This is a method great for beginners and perfect for painting larger batches of miniatures. First step is to prime the miniature white. My intention was to use Citadel white spray paint, a paint most of you can get a hold of, only to realize my can was empty. I visited the Games Workshop store in town only to be given slightly ironic responses over the fact that I assumed they would have been restocked with white rattle cans lately. So instead I went to my local friendly game store and got a can of Vallejo white. I'm going to combine a few methods here, working with the strength of yellow hobby paints, namely great transparent versions, having a white base coat to then cover with transparent yellow, like yellow contrast paint, gives a great vibrant yellow surface. Adding to that, a swift way to give that yellow some depth and character. For this, we're going to use oil paint. Oil paint mixed with white spirit to create an oil wash. But it's not going to go on top of the yellow surface, it's going underneath, as a foundation for the yellow paint to come. What we're going to do is add some colour to the recesses and shaded areas of the miniature. A colour that, because of colour theory and physics and the fact that the world is indeed round and all of that, will change in appearance when filtered by transparent yellow paint. My favourite colour for this is magenta, that filtered with yellow on top results in a sort of dark muted orange. Beautiful. But I want to show you how you can use exactly the same method, yet render quite different results by changing out the colour of the oil paint. So why oil paint for this first step? Well, honestly, I can't think of anything that can do this as simply and swiftly as oil paint. The great thing about oil paint and white spirit is that it does not really interfere with acrylic paint. We can paint on a wash of this stuff and then remove whatever we don't want, leaving only paint in the recesses. Making an oil wash is easy. In this case, I'm using about 4 drops of odorless white spirit from Winsor & Newton. And what I imagine is half a drop of oil paint, trying to stay in the ratio of about 1 part oil paint to 10 parts white spirit. I make a wash for each individual paint. We've got a magenta, like a dark pink, a permanent Geranium Lake, like a bright, warm, almost grapefruit pink, a Cerulian Blue Hue, try saying that 10 times fast, a bright blue, a French Ultramarine, a dark blue, and a raw umber, a medium warm brown. You might think these paint names are as well covered in gibberish as Games Workshop paint names, but there is in fact more to it. Cerulean is an actual word describing blue, like turquoise or cyan. Lake is a technical term used for synthetic pigments. Ultramarine is an old name. The paint is in fact very old, originally made from ground-up lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone found beyond the sea, which is what ultramarinus means in Latin. And well, marine and sea and blue, yeah, you got it. Raw umber is a bit more obscure, but Earthshade, as in Agrax Earthshade, used later on in this video, appears to be inspired by the very same pigment, and therefore probably contains it too. We'll never know, because for some reason hobby paint brands don't say what's in the bottle, but raw umber is a natural pigment found in the earth, and is a paint historically used a lot in the shadows. Okay, moving on. After fully covering each miniature with this thin mixture, I let them sit for about 20 minutes or so. I want the paint to start to dry just a little, so that when I remove the excess paint, I won't as easily accidentally remove paint from the recesses. I've got 3 types of tools to remove the excess oil wash, 3 types of eraser. Makeup sponges for most of the heavy work, regular-sized and small-sized Q-tips for detailed work, and my brush as a last resort. The reason for black Q-tips is just because I've found this particular sort does not leave strands of cotton behind, something that can be a bit of an issue with some brands of Q-tips. I dip in white spirit, but wipe or press out excess, wanting moist tools, not wet, and then start wiping the miniature, starting up top, moving down with a light hand, hoping to leave oil paint in all the recesses and shaded areas, as well as in the surfaces facing towards the base. Only something's not right. The oil paint is not coming off like it should. It's kinda stuck, yet rubbing hard enough and all the paint is coming off. And with that I mean all the white. This is not supposed to be happening. It's never happened before. I was flummoxed. I've painted a lot more than 52 miniatures by now using solvent-based paints on top of acrylics. Oil and white spirit-based techniques, enamel and thinner-based techniques, and this never happened. Now, if this is a reactivation scandal or just me being uninformed, I don't know. The only plausible explanation that comes to mind is that the white Vallejo spray is in fact a solvent-based paint. Why they do this without a big warning, I don't know. It's strange, as a lot of modelers use solvent-based paints. Worrying about dissolving one's primer when painting is not something that feels comforting. I obviously assumed that this Vallejo paint would be like any other rattle can in the hobby store. I mean, it's just like they would put enamel paint in regular dropper bottles, have them next to all their other regular acrylic ranges, assuming people would know the difference. And yes, I had let the paint sit for more than 24 hours before applying the oil wash. This was so not the plan for this video. Quite the opposite, actually. What I wanted was to show how great oil paint and white spirits can be. How easy they are to use and to great effect. Not clouding people's minds with dissolving base coats and hobby disasters. I mean, I only got the rattle can in the first place to show you how this is a technique available for everyone, to appear more user-friendly than when using my airbrush for priming. And all the cool shots in slow motion, rattle canning, and there was a storm on. Honestly, I'd planned the making of this video, getting all the paint in time to shelter from a snowstorm, yet still be able to make YouTube content. Getting another rattle can would mean facing the storm. In the end, there was only one thing to do. Prove that this was an anomaly. With the steel plate under my shirt, it's time for that final showdown. To save my last bullet, shoot through the rope of a hanged hobbyist, saving them from certain hobby failures. This is, in the end, what you've got us for. YouTube content creators that brave storms to make the hobby space safe from things like reactivation bandits. Funnily enough, Games Workshop had also braved through the storm, and my local friendly game store was freshly stocked up on white Scar Rattle Can Primer, the one I intended to get from the start. I also got white paint from AK Interactive and Army Painter, together with a Montana water-based white spray already in my cupboard. I want to show you that the Vallejo incident is indeed an anomaly. I sprayed on the different paints on some sprue, paint we will later on try to dissolve in white spirit. I also reprimed my Space Marines with the white Scar spray, convinced that there was no need to wait for my sprue test. I've got to say I was surprisingly impressed by the nice smooth surface that this paint created. I could now go back to the beginning, pre-disaster, recreate the same oil washes, cover my miniatures in paint, let them sit for about 20 minutes to then go back and remove excess on all the areas I want pure yellow, leaving thin oil paint in the places where I want a darker tint. And this time, all was well. The makeup sponge wipes surfaces clean like something out of a detergent commercial, without affecting the white primed surface at all. How much you remove here is a matter of personal taste. Wherever the oil paint is left on, there will be a darker color, tinted shadows. If one leaves a streaky, messy surface, it will be visible in the end. But after doing this a few times, it's rather easy to find a good workflow. I'm removing a lot of the oil paint, going for a discreet shading, but if one spends a little more time on this step, real cool depth and effect can be created with ease. We're now going to let these miniatures sit in a warm and well-ventilated place overnight, or until the next hobby session. Because the oil paint is thinned down excessively, this wash will dry relatively fast for oil paint. But I'd not move on to the next step for at least a day. You might be wondering about my claim to speed when all this waiting for paint to dry is needed. Drying time being something that quite a few people hold against oil paints. I'm convinced that when painting batches of miniatures for an army, and that's when you're after swiftness, right? You won't be spending a lot of brush time on each miniature to create the very yellow that we're working on. After all, as long as you don't use Vallejo primer, it's in the end going to be only a 4-step process, with very little attention to detail needed. There is weight needed between some of the steps, but I'm also convinced that this is how hobby time works out for a lot of people. Working on something for a few hours to then come back a few days later, or a week later, or a month later. And efficient painting is mainly about planning what little time you have rather than painting for 48 hours straight. Now with the sprue test, after soaking in white spirit for over an hour, I tried to get the paint to dissolve. Or even just act as if it cared the slightest about my desperate attempt to inflict damage. I even resorted to intensive toothbrushing, not a scratch, on any of the sprues. So, again, you'll be fine, as long as you don't use white Vallejo rattle can primer. My recommendation would actually go to the Games Workshop paint. It's probably more expensive, but I did enjoy the smooth result. We're now going to add the yellow Imperial Fist Contrast paint diluted with a contrast medium. 1 part medium to 2 parts yellow paint. The dilution with contrast medium makes for a less intense paint that to me suits this technique better. Using a contrast style paint is one of the simplest ways to apply a smooth coat of transparent yellow with a brush. The nature of the contrast paint will also render a sense of highlights on the raised and most exposed areas of the miniature, as the paint sort of pulls away from them. What we don't want is puddles. This contrast paint is not fully transparent, and if slapped on too thick, you will end up covering the oil wash layer with yellow pigment, spoiling the entire effect. I try to work in sections, doing my best to smooth out the contrast paint, sometimes helping it along, pushing it away from the areas I want more highlighted. By now, I hope you can start to see the effect of the much discussed initial layer of oil paint. There's different shades of yellow going, tinted versions of the contrast paint. Also, all miniatures have this great sense of being pin-lined. Every recess in the armor is a lovely darker shade, as well as subtle gradients of shading in places. Painting all that by hand with regular opaque paints, glazing and all that would be a very time-consuming thing. Plus, the surface of the miniatures is utterly smooth, hardly a single brush stroke visible. There is one last step to perfect this yellow technique, to add a thin layer of Agrax Earthshade, tying everything together. But first, I want to paint all the other bits that are not supposed to be yellow. Well, actually, the first thing I'm going to do is add a layer of varnish on one of the pauldrons because I want to put a transfer there. An initial layer of varnish will aid the transfer process, and one way to save time is to paint on the varnish now, so that by the time I've painted all the various non-yellow bits on the Mini, the varnish will have cured enough for me to be able to add the transfer. I'm treating the rest of the paint job as tabletop standard, using mainly contrast paints and other transparent paints. Metallic paints for the weapons, lightly brushed on over the Black Templar contrast paint. I think the most noticeable thing here is a pretty nice contrast paint recipe for leather. Equal parts of snakebite leather, wildwood and contrast medium. I used the same on any skulls and on the bases, because why waste paint? The big thing here is to try and not get paint on the yellow surface. It will take more time and effort to try and clean that up than slowing down the workflow to a pace that minimizes mistakes. There's plenty of options for this yellow armor and plenty of ways to refine it according to taste. Leaving more of the initial oil wash will render more dramatic results. Or once the first oil paint cleanup is done, one can go back and paint on thin streaks of thin oil paint, mimicking some tasty shading. The yellow can be chipped afterwards with a grey paint and a sponge, or painted on scratch marks and dirt. One can edge highlight the yellow in places. The sky's the limit. I've left mine very conservative for you to see the cleanest, simplest result. This technique is not reserved for Space Marines. It's a great way to get a good and swift yellow even if it's not an all-yellow scheme. You can use the oil paint shaded recess thing as a foundation for other transparent or contrast paints, like a coloured slapshot base, or just move along with regular opaque paints. As a side note, a favoured way of painting yellow for those with an airbrush is to first prime a miniature pink or magenta, and then zenithal prime over that with a white, leaving nice gradients of pink in the shaded areas. Following this up with a yellow ink through the airbrush, and the result is quite stunning. I do think that adding a pin wash of magenta oil wash as well before the yellow to get distinct separation in the recesses is probably a winner. Once the transfers are in place and dry, kinda tricky, I varnish again on top of the transfer. And finally, once that is dry, I finish off by covering the entire miniature in a 50-50 mix of Agrax Earthshade and contrast medium. This is like adding a filter of dirt. I like that. Toning things down a little, also adding a grittier vibe. But it's not necessary. One great benefit, though, is that it covers all the places where the yellow paint meets the other paints, hiding possible mistakes, giving the entire mini a smoother look. As a final touch, I dirty down some of the backpack ventilation radiator things with Nuln oil, and overflow the base with a dark red ochre pigment powder, the swiftest of base enhancers. Suddenly we're on Mars again, and we're happy to be here. I've missed the crunch of red dirt under my boots. Dirt that obviously spreads, so I make sure to dust the legs of the miniature with some of the pigment powders as well. To get the pigment powder to stick, I drip on some white spirit. This will not seal the powder completely, but it will hold it in place so that once dry, I can matte varnish the miniature without just blowing off all the powder. I'm using my favourite Ultramatte varnish from AK Interactive. I just like my minis chalky. Personal preference. With the rims painted black, we now have some real nice looking yellow Space Marines. Which one's your favourite? I'm personally in favour of the magenta version, as I said at the beginning of the video. The other versions are to show you what you can do with a little oil paint and some simple colour theory. I kinda think the light blue one is cool too, but could have been exaggerated a bit more. I mean, as I said, I was careful. We can compare here to some of my test minis. These are the same paints, but excessively exaggerated in the opposite direction. I need to say that there has been some theatrics involved in this video, and one needs to be highlighted. Please don't throw rattle cans in the bin. Recycle them responsibly. And if you're not used to using white spirit, just read up on what it is, and if you need to take any precautions. I hope you enjoyed this video, that it might be helpful. There's several ways you can support the continued creation of videos like this one. Like and subscribe, tell your friends, recommend me to your mum if you haven't already. There's a Patreon linked in the description. This gives you access to the 52 Miniatures Discord server, where you can chat not only to me, but to a lovely community of painters and hobbyists. You can super comment here on YouTube or during one of my many live streams. There's also links down below to the merchandising places. Thank you for watching. Bye.